Hello, I'm Andre Walton. I'm here to talk to you today about creativity. And I want to ask you, if you were at a networking gathering or something like that, and you went up to talk to somebody, asked what they did for a living, and they said, "Oh, I'm in creativity," how would you react to that? Would you find it positive, a little weird, or would you wander off pretending your phone was ringing? If they said, "Oh, I'm in agriculture," or "I'm in accountancy," that would have been pretty clear to you what you've got a very good general idea of what they do during the day. With creativity, that's really not the case. And one of the consequences of that, I believe, is that creativity tends to be trivialized. So I want to reposition that with you today, and I hope that I can persuade you that creativity is actually about how we think. I would be surprised if maybe while walking the dog or standing in the shower, you hadn't thought at some point, how did we get here? How did we get to have the iPhone, the internet, and some mythical muse called Alexa that can turn on the irrigation, add something to my shopping list, unlock the front door for the pizza guy? Now, Charles Darwin gave us a pretty good roadmap, I think, regarding how we evolved to where we are physically today. But having opposable thumbs does not explain how we got this amazing little iPhone that can take HD video or tell me where I am on this planet to an accuracy of a few yards. That is creativity. And that is something that we have always had. From the bow and arrow to the wheel to the jet engine and the internet, creativity is the source of our social evolution. Take a look at this petroglyph from the Valley of Fire in southern Nevada. It's scratched through a thin black crust of scorched rock to reveal these items. We're seeing a hunter. He's got a spear in his hand. We're looking at the thing that he's hunted. We're looking at a river here. And we have the sun to give us some direction. This is a map. And our prehistoric cartographer has created this so that his nomadic tribe, when they come back next year, will have all that information just in case he doesn't survive the winter. This is creativity, and it's been with us forever. It's also been with us as individuals forever. Every day, even before they could communicate in any language that I could understand, my granddaughters were bringing me objects and finding unusual ways to use them. The pepper grinder became a cell phone, the salad strainer a helmet, and the dog was coerced into being a battle horse, but that didn't last for very long. This is making sense of the world, and it is pure creativity. You can notice that the thinking process at this age can hop seamlessly between intuitive, and divergent thinking processes. A while ago, when my middle daughter, Reagan, was 8 and her younger sister, Peyton, was 6, they'd just been weighed a couple of days before. Peyton, the older one, weighed in as about 55 pounds, and her younger sister at about 42. Now, later in the week, we had a group of family members who were sitting around the table after dinner, and one of them, who was desperately trying to lose weight, proudly announced that he had just lost over 40 pounds. Now, quick as a flash, Reagan said, "Wow, that's a Peyton." It was roughly the weight of her sister, weighed in a couple of days before. So a Peyton is now a new unit of measurement to our family. It's equal to 42 pounds. But making that connection between her sister's weight and the weight lost by the family member is pure creativity. In other words, making connections that are not usual or obvious. That's divergent thinking. And certainly in the world of social science, divergent thinking is often used as a proxy for creativity. So what do you think happens that stifles that youthful, innate creativity we all had as kids? Well, in a general sense, what happens is socialization. Probably some of you thought, schooling, other kinds of structures that were put in place. But in general, that's socialization. When we start to go to school, our focus changes. For the most part, we've mastered the basics of survival. We keep our fingers out of the way when the car door's being slammed shut. We don't touch the stove top, even though it's been turned off. It's not wise to give the dog's tail an enthusiastic tug, that sort of thing. So now we have to turn from being physicists to being social psychologists and learn about all those other small people suddenly surrounding us as we start to go to school, along with adults who have different roles than mummy and daddy had. We also start to learn how others react to our actions and our intended actions. And this is social norms. How well we navigate through the maze of social norms is a pretty good predictor of how well we will get on with others for the rest of our lives. Although we probably don't know that, of course, at the time. Those social norms do a lot more to us than just guide us as to how to fit in, that they are also associated with an innate need we all have that is connected with others. Being connected with others has always had a critical root in our makeup. And its roots, of course, come from survival. Whether you are hunting, gathering, or being hunted, a group is a much safer place to be in than on one's own. Iceman, which is the rather unimaginative name given to a 5,300-year-old mummified body that was found frozen in the Tyrolean Alps. With a little help from global warming, he suddenly appeared just a few years ago, and scientists figured that he had died while on a hunting trip, alone, possibly as the result of a flint arrowhead that had shattered his scapula. Interestingly, he was carrying a small woven sack of grain of a type that could only have been cultivated. A snap for the journey, maybe? Either way, he was a member of a tribe, but for some reason, he seems to have wandered off. He provides evidence that tribal life is innate to human beings. But being drawn to the company of others conflicts with another innate drive, and that is to be and to seem to be unique. This drive has its roots in our survival also. Now, we can present this dichotomy as we see on this figure here. When we're on the right side of the dichotomy, perhaps we're at work or church or chess club or weekend Harley meet, we're focused on being similar to others. Perhaps we dress in a manner that is in keeping with other group members. We may well change our language. If you want to fit in, you may not wear your Harley leathers to church on Sunday. However, when we're at the uniqueness end of the spectrum, it is our differences from others that is on our mind and subconsciously guiding us. So at which end of this dichotomy do you think that creativity is? Well, as you probably guessed, it's at the uniqueness end. When we're being creative, we are generating something that is itself unique and different from that that's gone before. That requires us to think differently from others, right? In other words, if we think the same as other people, we're not likely to produce something which is different than has gone before. To be creative, then, we have to express our individuality. I did a bunch of experiments 20 years ago that showed this quite dramatically, along with a few other phenomena that I may have time to get to. In other words, working in groups feels good because it satisfied our need to be with other people, but it is not good for creativity. In the commercial world, that's the downside of team building. It's also a drawback from traditional brainstorming techniques, by the way, which never did fulfill the initial promise of increasing the number of unique ideas that are created. It is actually, that number is at its highest when we're brainstorming individually, and then we come together to discuss it rather than trying to generate these ideas as a group. As you probably know, nations can be ranked on a scale of individualism versus collectivism. Individualism is where we put the value of the individual above that of the collective. And similarly, collectivists believe that the group has a certain priority over the individual. So the good of the group is put before the individual. It's called the Hofstadter scale. In collectivist countries, people tend to put their own preferences behind that of the group. And in individualist countries such as the US, the individual is expected to, and it certainly is accepted, that they put their own good and the good of their family, which is an extension of themselves, above those of the rest of the group, in this case, the nation. So do you think creativity would be at its highest in collectivist countries or individualist? Well, it transpires that it's in individualist countries, because in individualist countries, the relationship between the individual and social norms, in other words, the extent to which they're guided by social norms, is less, and hence the fact that they feel less obligation, if you like, to the group. So in collectivist countries, the opposite is true. And although there is creativity, it has a tendency to be evolutionary rather than quantumly revolutionary. Revolutionary creativity has a tendency to alienate people. There are several examples of that in music and in various other environments. These amazing Kathakali dancers from India, they're allowed to change their elaborate makeup from time to time. Perhaps if they're taking over, one actor is taking over the role from another. They are allowed to make changes, but they have to be very small changes. These are just very, very evolutionary changes. Think of it as creativity designed not to offend anyone. Anyway, there is more about that in my upcoming book, which is coming out shortly. So which side of this figure represents folks who have the strongest connection with social norms? Well, as you might guess, it's the groupie side. The individualist side is generally occupied by people who have looser connections with social norms. Now, my mum and dad were excellent artists. My mum was the youngest student to be accepted into Britain's top fine arts program at Reading University. And my father was only just out of his teens when he became the cartoonist for one of the UK's premier newspapers. I came home one day from teaching at the university here, switched on the TV and saw one of Dad's paintings on an easel on Antiques Roadshow. So he was a minor, globally known artist. You can see from this picture that my mum painted that my dad was pretty old. Well, he was 60 when I was born and my mother was 25. And they thought nothing of that discrepancy. They were never married or lived together. And mother was a cook housekeeper and had various other jobs, none for very long. One day, an ominous black car showed up and she was carted off to a psychiatric facility. Only much later did I realize that her loose connections with social norms probably accounted for her being marginalized and ostracized, and that took its toll. I tell you this story because if you're a coach, then clients who are very creative should ring a little alarm bell. There is a much higher probability that they have psychiatric problems. And that's really nothing to do with being creative. It's to do with being marginalized from mainstream society. Now, that's by no means necessarily the case. There are ways around that. One of those ways around it is that if people are very highly supported in their youth, this will tend not to be the case. Or if they manage to establish a group of people who are like them in that they're highly creative. So clearly they're not going to marginalize each other. And this group, of course, will tend to have certain commonalities like loose connections with social norms. My story has a happy ending, by the way. Mum went on to live a relatively untroubled life and ended her days very happily, with literally dozens of friends turning up for her funeral. So creatives need group membership as much as anybody else, but they also need the space to be creative. You quite often find creative people mixing with other creative people for the reasons I've just mentioned, in the same way that deaf people mix and often marry other deaf people. The deaf and the blind also have a high degree of a higher chance of having mental problems than the remainder of society for similar reasons. So if you were to rank yourself on a scale, I wonder how creative you think you are. It's an interesting exercise. I want to change tack just for a moment. If you can think of an aha moment, then do so. Maybe you were seeking the answer to a question or challenge, and the answer suddenly came to you. Try and remember when that moment occurred, in what kind of circumstances, what you were doing. Now, people that research these kinds of things suggest that it happens most likely when we are like walking, biking, something similar. For me, it tends to happen when I'm meditating. There's an interesting thing that wondrous, that incredible organ, the brain has about it. The two hemispheres of the brain are connected together by something called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a thick band of nerve fibers that connects the left and right cerebral hemispheres and plays a crucial role in transferring information between those, enabling complex cognitive processes like thinking, memory, coordinated movement. Now, considering how incredible the brain is, it is just amazing to me that the corpus callosum is a pathetically poor information conduit. I mean, in the world of broadband, this would be like, well, sort of piece of string with a tin can at each end. But adults that have learnt music at an early age, by sort of 4 or 5 years old, the corpus callosum is significantly larger than those that didn't. All is not lost if you didn't learn music at an early age, because there's another interesting phenomenon. The corpus callosum has been found to be a better data conduit when you're doing some kind of physical exercise that takes little cognitive toll on your mind, like walking or doing something similar, biking or even swimming, that kind of thing. Possibly vacuuming, although I wouldn't know about that. So an important addition to clients that are stuck is to take a walk. And I incorporate this advice in almost all my coaching. I believe it has a lot of other benefits too. If you can find somewhere in nature that they can go and walk, it actually fires different cognitive neural pathways that are beneficial for creativity and for different modes of thought. And that brings us on to the real topic of this presentation, which is spherical thinking. This is characterized by thinking with both intuitive and deductive processes. You can paraphrase that in other ways, but let me give you an example. I play flute, jazz flute specifically, and I had a jazz trio in Portugal. Even if you don't like jazz, it's interesting in that much of the time you're playing in tune and in time with other people when you're playing jazz, just like with any other music. Sometimes people are even playing, using notes on a page. Following that preordained rhythm and chordal structure, there are times then when it's time to improvise. And when you do that, you're departing from established tunes to create your own tune on top of it. You've still got to obey chordal rules and so forth, but basically you are now creating. You're using your own creativity in your music. Put another way, your music goes from being generated from the logical deductive sort of area, not the area of our brain, but type of thinking, um, to spontaneous expression. And that's another example of when the structured rule-following mode of thinking gives way to expression. Sure, improvisation does require you to follow plenty of rules to make it listenable to. But other than that, really, it is pure expression. I want you to think for a moment back to a memorable decision that you made. Now, how did you make that decision? Do you believe you made it through a process of logical deduction, or was there something else that sort of popped into your mind, whether you might describe it as thinking from the gut or by any other technique? What were the processes? If you used a set of scales with pros on one side and cons on the other, then that was really an indication that you were basing your decision very much on logic. But as we know, there are other ways of doing that. It used to be that people referred to left brain, right brain as a proxy for deductive or logical thinking, left brain, or emotionally driven or intuitively thinking on the right. That model was debunked in the early days of fMRI, which is functional MRI imaging. And that means we can actually image as in real time, as the person being imaged is actually, in terms of our research, thinking different things. And this is absolutely fascinating. As participants change their thought focus from intuitive thinking to deductive, so different neural pathways can be seen to illuminate. Now, some of the theories from my first book were studies and hypotheses, and they have now been validated by fMRI, which has been fascinating to follow. One of the things that transpires is that there are these distinct and visible changes as you go from thinking deductively to thinking intuitively. Now, I don't want to disappear down neural pathways rabbit hole because it's it's so fascinating. I can literally rabbit on about it for many an hour. But intuitive thinking falls into the category, that similar kind of category. It's also a fascinating thing to think about how we organize what goes on in our lives and how we memorize it and how we compartmentalize the subjects of our thinking in such a way that they can contribute to thinking about similar events in the future. And there's a lot more of that in my book. I want to switch, though, to System 1 and System 2 thinking. This has gone, research on this and these ideas have been developed for a long time, and they seem to have stood the test of time. Remember how it felt when you had your first driving lesson? I can remember being appalled at the idea I had to depress the clutch. This was a stick shift. Get out of one gear, choose another gear to go to, while thinking about whether I needed to brake. And all this time trying to figure out when I'd have time to change the direction, flick the direction indicator. And I'm then expected to look in the rearview mirror. All this was extremely effortful. And that is System 2 thinking. System 2 is the way we think when we're doing something new or complex. And in the terms of learning to drive, it's new and complex, or it was for me. Compare that to driving now, an embarrassing number of decades later. Unless I see that something untoward might happen, all the processes involved are well-established neural pathways and can fire off without my consciously thinking about it. That is System 1. The use of System 2 thinking in the first driving lesson illustrates how stressful a simple procedure can be if you haven't familiarized the sequence sufficiently for it to become a System 1 neural network. taking a sequence of actions from system 2 to system 1 dramatically speeds up the process. So system 1 requires no conscious thinking. It's something you can think of as just being an intuitive knee-jerk reaction. And it makes it safer to perform unless we perceive an action to be known as a system 1 pathway, when in fact it isn't, and that confusion can arise. This summarizes system 1 versus system 2 thinking. System 1 has no creativity involved in it, because creativity does require conscious thinking. There is no analysis, and there's little or no conscious thought. It's simply autopilot. I'll talk a little bit about coaching those with burnout a bit later, but for now, I just want to say that exhaustion in general leads us to be parsimonious as we can with our physical and mental energy. And that means maximizing system 1 thinking in lieu of system 2. And that means creative thinking is at its minimum. It also transpires that when we are stressed, we tend towards the process of seizing and freezing, whereby we make a decision based on the first solution that comes to mind. We seize on it and then fail to seek other solutions. I think of this as a racehorse with blinders on, blinkers, depending on where you come from. I find this concept extremely useful in my coaching. I don't know if I'm a stress magnet, but many of my clients are stressed when they come to me about something or other. And if I can help alleviate that stress, then those blinders tend to open up. And when that happens, more options become viable, and more stress evaporates. So stress and seizing and freezing and excessive system 1 thinking are all in the same category. Using blinders is a useful analogy because it's an important proxy for creativity. In the experimental world, we have divergent thinking, which is a proxy for creativity. And this is divergent. This is literally about doing that, which is like taking those blinders off. As we reduce the blinders, our angle of view, so we tend towards convergent thinking, and that's where we get to kind of seizing and freezing. A major cause of stress is the sensation that we don't have any positive options, and this has a nasty feedback effect, because feeling that we don't have options causes us yet more stress. So we can spiral into a very negative place as that goes on. So, and you can see that seizing and freezing can reinforce that sensation. So reducing stress has benefits on so many levels. This stress scenario is very much in line with someone getting stuck on the same narrative. And since there are no other perceived options to talk about, I've seen this kind of scenario in career coaching in a similar way to seizing and freezing, where a client is in a panic, having lost a job, even if they really did enjoy the job. They can't get away from applying for the same kind of position because they're in a state of some panic. When standing back and doing some brainstorming by themselves or with friends or family or with me, they can see that more options are necessary, and that if they just took one step back and had a look at the problem with a bigger sort of angle of vision, more options would come up, and in fact maybe going back into the same kind of job isn't necessarily positive anyway. So as well as reducing stress, introducing creative thinking has several benefits, because creative thinking is inherently making that viewpoint diverge. And that's what we're doing when we're introducing both intuitive and deductive thinking at the same time. Because a lot of what we've been talking about tends to be logically based. The system 1 thinking is really has no conscious function at all. So that's a knee-jerk reaction, which tends to be just logically based. That's either on or off. So creative thinking tends to remove the blinders and open up other options. In part because we're opting for different neural pathways, going from stress-induced system one thinking to more conscious thinking in system two. As we'll see in a minute, you're making a quantum shift in thought processes when you change from system one to system two. Stress also, creative thinking also breaks the repetitive negative narrative, eroding the strength of that neural pathway. And also creativity is positively correlated with happiness. So the more we can get ourselves, our clients, whoever, to think creatively, the more likely it is that they're going to carry that happiness on through to them in their lives. The other thing that it does is to help restore the balance in our thinking processes. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but first, if we're trying to reintroduce creative thinking into people's lives, we have to limit the amount of system one thinking they're doing, because system one, as I've said before, has no creativity associated with it. But system one is very tempting for us to use because it's so parsimonious on the energy involved. I want to skip forward to ways in which we can actually put this into practice. Take a moment to think about in what kinds of situations you might be able to make changes in your life. And these can be very, very trivial changes. When we go to our favorite restaurant, maybe we make sure we order something new from the menu. Perhaps when you're driving to work, it's something that we can do is to change the route we take to work. There are lots of small things that we can start doing, and the purpose behind this is that we are moving out of these well-established neural pathways to open the opportunity of creating new neural pathways. So there are many small ways when you find yourself jumping towards a particular set of clothes or set of shoes, or some very trivial choice in your life. If you start to make adjustments to that and say, okay, I'll wear my Mickey Mouse socks to work today. These kinds of things encourage us to take new actions and introduce the possibility of intuitive thinking into our lives. I'm going to switch tack again right now. What if I told you that a survey last year found that 2 out of every 3 adults in the US had either had or they knew someone that had had a particular disease. And that disease, just in healthcare costs alone, were of the order of $200 billion last year. And when you add in loss of productivity and so forth, it comes to around $1 trillion. Well, I'm talking about burnout. And if you know someone or have experienced burnout yourself, you'll be aware of how incredibly debilitating it can be. And when I was 35, I was running businesses in the UK and in the US. And I just begun my trip around the world, which happened every year, doing trade shows in Chicago, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and then back to LA. And there were 2 things that happened in my life that were really made my life very, very difficult. And really, it changed. All the excitement just disappeared out of being an entrepreneur for a while. But one of the consequences was that I had burnout and I couldn't sleep. I used to just lie on the couch and watch TV until the screen went blank and go into the office, try not to look too much like a zombie. And it was devastating. And there were several other minor projects that I had that I put on the back burner because I didn't feel capable of dealing with them. And I sought help. And the single biggest source of relief for me came from learning to meditate. I mean, literally, the first day of the 3-day training sessions, um, I slept very well that night. So, that was the beginning. And here, over 35 years later, I still find meditation incredibly useful. I was diagnosed with cancer a few years ago, and I believe meditation had a significant contribution to overcoming that. Now, people who haven't had burnout seldom realize how debilitating it is, but it can be on a par with PTSD. And burnout is one of the areas that I'm now focusing on with my coaching. Um, it's generally characterized by the medical profession who really don't recognize it in a formal sense anyway, because it has so many different variations, it has so many different ways it's difficult to positively diagnose. It's generally characterized as stress-induced. And I have no doubt that in general is true. But I also believe that there's an element of balance that is missing when you get burnout. And that balance is between the two modes of thought, intuitive and deductive. We live in a very deductive world. We're always being bombarded with information that it relates to deductive thought processes. We're being told we need life insurance policies for, in case we don't make it through the next year. We need calculations for our, have we got adequate money in the bank for our pension? There's all sorts of different deductive processes that go on. And I believe we're a bit out of balance with that. And I think that balance contributes. So one of the things that I do with my burnout clients is I like to ask them, what in the last 6 months has changed that has suddenly made you to be more stressed? And sometimes there are very specific things that went on, instances. But after some discussion with some of the others, they have to say that really no major things occurred, that it has just gradually sort of crept into place. And so I believe it's still stress, but I like to redefine stress at that point as the inability, the inadequacy of your resources to deal with a specific situation. And I believe that I have found in my coaching that in taking people into a space where they can start to do things creative, enjoy things creative, think things creatively, has a dramatic effect on burnout. And I mentioned previously that repetitive narratives that people can sometimes have, and any coaches out there will, I think, relate to this. We can break those chains of narratives by changing tack with the way that we think and the way that we persuade our clients to think. You start to introduce, you start asking questions, talking to clients about things creative and about things that are just simply different that can be different in their lives. And you start getting into more intuitive processes and less logical deductive processes. And that breaks the chain of thinking narrative, which is kind of stuck. So this is really breaking the mold for clients, can be very useful in these kinds of circumstances. The kinds of things that I suggest to clients once the one of the problems with coaching burnout is that if it's severe, then the level of motivation that clients have to do anything at all is very, very low. So we have to get past that stage first. But having done that, I then kind of encourage them to do things like, well, maybe there's, a bar or club near you that will have an open mic night. You can go and listen to some music. If you go walk through the streets of your town, are there art galleries? Is there an art museum by any chance? And, try and get them to expand their views that might include things that are the result of creativity. Also, just simply going to places that have beauty associated with them. I mean, sometimes that's the view at the back of me is the Sierra Nevada, and just looking at that is an empowering phenomenon. But so there's natural beauty, and then there's plenty of man-made beauty, and it's just, if we can get people to open their eyes to that, then that is all part of that process for changing neural pathways. We can think of neural pathways as tracks in the snow. The first time we take a trip to the mailbox after it snowed, there's one set of footsteps there, and one set back again after we've been. And after a couple of weeks, the path is not just clearly visible. If the snow is deep around it, then for a tiny person, it could be difficult to actually step outside of that pathway. So you can think about that as an analogy for neural pathways. And the more that they are sort of carved into the ground, the more difficult they are to move out of. And that really is when you start to see habit and as an extreme, addiction. That's really what one's then looking at. Going back to intuition, put simply, intuition is the ability to understand something without using conscious reasoning, right? So this is without having to dive into your mind to find a reason why you should be thinking this, a reason why you should be doing this. So basically, the unconscious mind analyzes a situation using past experience, knowledge and patterns, and then pops that into the forefront of your mind under certain circumstances that you see as being different to something that went before. But it doesn't do that when it's needed. It does all that thinking beforehand. So after a certain situation has arisen, there are ways in which that information is stored, and then that is triggered into the forefront of your mind later on. The important thing about intuitive or creative thinking, I believe creative thinking, by the way, is the combination of these two different types. But the important thing about intuitive thought is it's not driven by logic directly. If there's any logic involved in it, which there typically is, that is something that was derived previously. If something that we did a while ago was quite successful, and we're in a similar situation again, it might trigger an intuitive reaction along similar lines. But that's a problem in terms of if this current situation differs in some important way that we don't recognize from the previous circumstance, then we don't tend to visit the new situation. So that's when we can have an error of judgment. And sometimes that error of judgment can be quite crucial. So why do we care about any of this? Well, it's not uncommon to have a client who is trapped in a sequence of negative thinking. I call it the hamster wheel effect. They tell you about their problem until second, third iteration, you sort of think, okay, we need to find a way to break this particular track of conversation because it's just not going anywhere. It's a system one kind of mode of conversation, and but realizing that negative pathway, that negative narrative is a neural pathway, gives us the clue that we need to make a quantum leap in terms of direction. And in my coaching, that is where I start to introduce the ideas of creativity. So I might dive straight in there and ask the client if they had ever played a musical instrument, or did they ever write, or did they ever draw or paint, and most people have done something creative in their past life, and that can jolt us into a different conversation, and that can be often, you can often see positive signs of excitement, signs of just enjoying this new thinking process. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for the moment. I have got 2 workshops coming out that I want to tell you about. The first is an expansion of what I'm talking about right now. So this is a workshop on spherical thinking, and I go into all the aspects of these things in much greater detail. Plus, we have exercises associated with that, and then after that, there will be a number of activities with basically play the role of client and coach to go through that, so we can really understand how this is put into practice. And I'll put that on the screen. And following that, there's going to be a set of workshop sessions. This will be a lengthy, much deeper process on coaching burnout, and that may attract life coaches that are not sure about their niche, but they want to be of help. This is a huge potential client base, and in general, because it's perceived and generally, and often is, work related, it is something that you don't really have to. There is more money available in general to sort this problem out than otherwise, because it is such a costly process for businesses and for clients themselves. So those 2 are coming up, and if you have any more interest, you've got my email here. Please feel free to drop me a line. Appreciate you listening to this event, and I look forward to hearing from you. Keep in touch for future videos. Thank you very much.